Her hand felt so small in mine. She smiled and gawked at the temple while we ascended the hundreds of steps to reach the peak. She was the youngest bride I had ever guided. The girl must have just come into womanhood, and God had already chosen her as an offering. As I took her from her parents before ascending the temple, she waved goodbye with a broad smile. They turned away without sparing their daughter a final glance. "Hey, sister, what's that?" The bride pointed to one statue lining the steps. It was a small, squat man with the head of a turtle and 6 long arms. "That's an avatar of our god. It represents his infinite patience," I explained, wishing she wouldn't talk to me. "Sister," she started. The words sent chills down my spine. Being reminded of family made the process even harder. The brides were never around long, and I hated cozying up to those I led to their deaths. "Call me handmaiden," I told her. She pondered for a second, feeling the word on her tongue. "No, that's too hard. Your sister." I sighed and led her further up the steps. I wasn't used to young ones. "What are we doing?" she asked, lagging behind. Her parents must have explained nothing. The temple gave them the arms, and they shipped her off without saying a word. Where could I begin? "You're a bride now. Your sacred duty is to become one with God for eternity." She stopped climbing the steps. "What does that mean?" she asked. I tugged on her arm, but she rooted herself to the spot. "I'm not supposed to tell you that. Follow me. We'll miss dinner if we waste any more time." I dragged her from her spot as she grumbled in protest. The rest of the climb was silent, with the occasional break for the bride to catch a fallen petal or chase a butterfly. At the gates of the temple, the priest and 4 monks waited for our arrival.
"Greetings, handmaiden. Is this the bride?"
The priest asked, his withered body hunched over and his lips thin and cracked. The bride hid behind me, clutching my robes and burying her face in the fabric.
"Yes, this is the girl."
I pried her arm from the silk and presented her so the priest could examine her more closely. The old man reached out a shriveled, cracked hand and caressed her dainty cheek.
"How pure. The Lord will surely be appeased with such an offering."
The bride cringed at the priest's touch, and my skin crawled at his lecherous tone and gaze. I returned the girl to my side and put myself between her and the priest.
"I'll show her around the grounds."
I took the girl's hand and tugged her after me.
"Blessings be upon you. And you as well."
The priest saw me off.
"Have her prepared by tomorrow, not a hair out of place."
He gave a cold, wry smile and a weak wave while I hurried off with the bride in tow. We passed the garden, where a handful of monks and fellow shrine maidens tended to the intricate arrangements of bonsai and various sculptures crafted from weaving together thousands of vines. Bride released my hand and ran over to the petal trails that lined the walkway. She picked up a handful and tossed them in the air, letting them rain down on her face.
"This place is pretty. I can't believe I get to stay here."
The bride waved to one handmaiden, who caught her eye. Handmaiden looked from her to me before hanging her head and turning away. There was a hint of scorn when we made eye contact, as though she blamed me. What could I do? She would do the same in my position. Compassion for the brides was misplaced. I had nothing to say to the bride's expectant look.
"Let's move along."
The girl pouted before grabbing my hand once more and proceeding down the halls. We arrived at the bridal chambers, a gaudy spectacle adorned with silks and paintings. Statues bearing blessings of longevity and fertility surrounded the oversized, cushy bed filled with soft down.
"We're here,"
I said. The bride's eyes sparkled. She circled the room in stunned silence, running her hand on the soft sheet and pillows.
"Is this all For me?
The bride sat on the bed, shaking with excitement.
These are the bride's quarters, so yes. This is amazing. I'm like a princess.
She laughed and pulled a pillow to her chest, rolling around in ecstasy.
I'm glad you like it. You should get some rest. The preparations for the ceremony will begin tomorrow.
I turned to walk out of the room.
Wait, sister!
The bride called after me. I grimaced and faced her. I'd nearly made it out, but for some reason, I turned back against my better judgment.
I told you to call me handmaiden. What's the ceremony?
She ignored me and asked, how could she be so ignorant? The entire village attended the ceremony yearly unless her parents purposely secluded her.
I told you already. You'll be wed to God. You'll join him and be together for eternity.
I inched toward the door. Having that conversation wasn't my responsibility. Usually, it would be the priest or her parents.
If it's so good, then why did Mum and Dad look away when I left? They didn't even wave.
Her countenance dropped. The vapid, superficial beauty of the temple could only hold off those doubts for so long. It seemed there was more to her situation than her parents greedily accepting the temple's payment and sending her off without a backward glance. The bride had an 8-pointed star mark on her neck, a clear sign that she was among the chosen women, undoubtedly chosen for the role.
The mark on your neck, how long have you had it?
I asked. The bride put her fingers to her neck and stroked the protruding lines.
I don't know. I think since I got all my teeth.
Impossible. God only bestowed the mark on women in adulthood. Did her parents hide her away that whole time?
And Mum and Dad live here too?
The bride crawled off the bed and stood before me, looking up at me. It was my first time tending to a chosen girl. I'd heard stories of handmaidens killed at the hands of resistant brides. But this was worse. I stopped myself and rushed out the door, leaving her alone in the big, beautiful, empty chamber. It was time to report to the chief handmaiden. I provided regular updates on the bride's mental and physical condition before the ceremony. My tall, lanky superior sat in her quarters, sipping a light broth and picking at rice.
Ah, handmaiden, is the bride safe in her suite?
She asked, placing aside her meager meal and greeting me.
Yes, Mom. She's resting in the bridal chambers now.
I hated her shrill voice. I couldn't count how often her grating yells had assailed my ears, berating and belittling me. But she was in a better mood that day. All of the temple's higher-ups grew excited as the ceremony approached, mostly from the tithes they collected on the days leading up to the ceremony. They'd be fat and happy for months afterward.
I'll be going now.
I bowed a light sweep before moving to the door.
Wait,
the chief handmaiden demanded, freezing me in my tracks.
One of your fellow handmaidens brought complaints about the bride. You'll find her in the chamber of penance. Take care of her.
The words came out rough and callous. The girl from the garden, that fool, must have spoken out and been caught. Her carelessness dragged me into a mess I wanted nothing to do with.
Is she...
I couldn't get the words out entirely. I knew the chamber of penance. We all did. Handmaidens never came out quite the same.
She should be conscious by now, but there's much cleaning to do. You have no qualms about the bride. Am I right in saying that?
It wasn't a question, no matter how she phrased it.
I would never question the temple's will.
I bowed deeply, concealing the bead of sweat that gathered on my forehead. The chief handmaiden took a long moment to examine my mannerisms. Eventually, she nodded, satisfied.
You may go.
I returned the nod and obeyed. The chamber of penance was underground, the entrance in the far corner of the temple. Stone steps carved into the ground led deep into the earth where the disobedient temple members received punishment. They had never sent me to the chamber, but I'd heard the screams. Young women cried out in agony. Their voices strained until they broke and could no longer make a sound. The wails must be like the cries of the souls damned to hell. Maybe the chamber brushed against that dark place, even from earth. The entrance was unguarded. I had a bucket of water and bandages in my arms. As I approached the steps, the metallic stench of blood wafted upward. Decades of old, dried blood littered the stone steps, reminders of those who tried to escape while still bearing the wounds of their torment. I descended the stairs. My legs trembled and nearly gave out with each step. When I was halfway down, I heard a quiet, muffled sobbing from inside. As I peered into the torch-lit chamber, I immediately recognized the handmaiden from earlier in an open cell. Girl curled into a ball in the center of her cell, clutching her hands to her chest. She didn't notice my approach.
Hey, you. I'm here to tend to your wounds.
I called out to her, standing over her defenseless, pitiful body. She rolled over to face me, revealing what she had endured. The torturers had pried her fingernails off. Soft, exposed flesh protruded and gushed blood, spilling down her fingers, palms, and to her wrists. Just looking at it made my stomach churn, and I winced. The girl responded with groans and a fit of coughing. I took her hand and a wet cloth to clean the open wound. As soon as I pressed the fabric to the flesh, she jerked back and yelped.
Hold still.
I pulled her hand back, quickly overpowered her, and carefully removed the grime.
Why did you have to say something? What did that accomplish?
I asked, while carrying out my duties. The girl avoided eye contact, instead pressing her head to the floor and wiping away the occasional tear.
She's so young. Why would a child... It's wrong.
The handmaiden clenched her jaw, a small vein protruding on her temple.
Do you think I support this? Of course it's disgusting, but we must appease God. Rather than doom us all, isn't it better to go along with the temple?
I asked. The other handmaiden scoffed.
So you're naive. Do you believe God has anything to do with this island? Nobody alive has heard his voice. God abandoned us long ago.
She laced her words with spite. They stabbed at me, and the cluster of doubts I had locked away deep within the recesses of my mind.
What about the mark? The protection from disaster? Even the oracles? Are you trying to say it's all false?
I gripped her hand too tight, causing fresh blood to gush from her exposed nails. The girl whimpered and swatted at my hand.
The mark is nothing more than a random trait. The rest is smoke and mirrors from the temple. I've overheard the priest talk. It's all deception. I have no reason to trust you. Be quiet and let me finish.
I had to reject her. The temple raised me, sheltered me my whole life, and I had nowhere to go without it. Her radical ideas would only land me next to her in the chamber all starved.
When they carry out the ceremony tomorrow, take a good look and remember that you said nothing.
She hissed. I stayed silent and bandaged her before allowing her to rest on my shoulder while we trudged up the stairs. After I finished with her, I went to the servants' quarters and lay on the cold, stiff burlap. It was a sleepless night. Visions of brides' smiling faces, memories of the 18 years I'd endured in the temples, and the punished handmaiden's words rattled around my head. Before long, the first rays of sunlight hit my bloodshot eyes and roused me from my bed. There were only 12 hours till the ceremony, and I had to prepare the young bride for the moment she met her fate. The bride would need a long, arduous ritual adorning process to be presentable for the ceremony. A young face caked with required makeup would look ridiculous, but the temple valued tradition over anything else, so it was up to me to do the honors. I knocked once on the sliding door to the bridal chambers, and they immediately opened, with the bride standing at the entrance.
Sister!
The bride grabbed my hand and dragged me into her room.
This bed is amazing. I've never slept that good before. I had a wonderful dream, I think. I forgot it, but I woke up feeling really happy.
She sat on the bed and patted the edge next to her.
Feel these sheets. Aren't they soft? Yes, they are very soft.
I walked to the closet, opening it and revealing the far too large gown.
The ceremony is today. We need to prepare.
I took the dress and held it up to the bride.
Put your arms up.
The bride obeyed, and I dressed her with the ritual vestments. It was made for a woman at least 7 years older than her, the fabric draped over her small, thin frame like a bedsheet. I had no time to hem it, so I would need to pin it as best I could. In perfect silence, I fitted the dress to the bride while she occasionally squirmed or giggled when the gown tickled her. After some quick thinking, the outfit seemed presentable.
Does it look good?
The bride asked, twirling to and fro, the gown swaying with her movements.
It'll have to do,
I replied. She hung her head, smile faltering.
Sister, I'm getting nervous. Can you please tell me what's going to happen?
Her hands trembled imperceptibly. A small blood dot bloomed on the dress's pure white fabric. I must have poked her with a pin, and she hadn't made a noise in protest.
All you have to do is follow me, then do whatever the priest tells you. Don't be scared.
A lump formed in my throat.
Nothing bad will happen to you. Oh, okay.
It didn't seem like my words had done much to soothe her nerves. She looked like a porcelain doll with the makeup completed and the gowns fit. Her face was a stark white, and her lips a bright red, unbefitting her young features. Another handmaiden poked her head into the room.
Is she ready? The ceremony is about to begin.
Yes, I said, taking the bride's hand and guiding her to the door.
Follow me,
I told her. The bride stepped behind me, forcing me to slow my pace.
Sister, how did you end up here?
She asked, stumbling slightly, unfamiliar with the heels I put on her feet.
I was left here before I can remember. All handmaidens are raised as children of the temple. My parents must have traded me here for a few bags of rice.
I couldn't remember the early days. Most of my childhood blended together in an arduous mush. The temple was the only world I knew. I would live and die confined to those grounds.
Do you like it here?
The bride looked up at me, squeezing my hand.
That's irrelevant. Do you think I'll fit in? Will you stay with me?
She asked. I looked straight ahead, ignoring the aching in my heart and the protests in my head.
I'll be with you as long as I can.
The bride smiled and picked up her pace until we walked side by side. We then ascended the steps to the top of the mountain, where the temple held the ceremony. The bride was exhausted by the time we reached the top, her chest heaving up and down and her legs shaking. Up ahead, nearly 100 villagers gathered before an altar carved from stone. The high priest stood over the altar, flanked by several monks. An aisle formed between the two crowds of villagers, leading through the masses and to the procession above.
Sister!
The bride glanced around at the many faces that all turned toward the two of us the moment we approached the aisle. The girl grabbed at my robes and hid behind me. Come. I stepped forward with her. Countless familiar faces crushed the bride with the weight of their stares. Dead silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic click-clack of the bride's heels against the ancient stone path, each tap echoing in the stillness. They watched her with eyes gleaming with expectation. As we approached the altar, the priest reached out a hand toward us and beckoned us forward. The bride looked at his withered, veiny hand and buried herself further into me.
Let's go. Don't you want this over with?
I asked. The bride nodded and stepped forward alongside me until we reached the top of the steps.
Greetings, bride. You look lovely today. The Lord will surely be pleased.
The priest's grin revealed a mouth full of yellowing, crooked teeth. Still refusing to meet his eyes, the bride clung to me while I pried her hand free, nudging her towards the priest. He placed a hand on her shoulder and gestured for the crowd's attention.
God has blessed us with another prosperous year,
the priest called out to the assembly. Murmurs of agreement rang out among the onlookers.
Our harvest was bountiful, our women were fertile, and once again, God held back the awesome might of nature from raining down hellfire.
The priest pointed to the mountain behind him. It was a lip of a dormant volcano. According to our teachings, the volcano once destroyed all life on the island, but through prayer and sacrifice, God soothed its fiery wrath, holding back the magma and ash.
We stand before God once again to give our thanks.
The priest took the bride and pulled her in front of him. She nearly stumbled to the ground, but was barely supported by the frail man.
Our lovely bride will join God in matrimony, renewing our eternal promise to him for another year of plenty.
The bride looked at me. I could feel her silent pleas, but I stayed rooted near the altar. 2 handmaidens came on stage and grabbed her by the arms. She shook, whimpering as they placed her on the cold stone. I stood nearby, looking down at her confused, desperate face.
Sister!
She reached out a hand to me, but I stepped back before it could make contact. A deep pit formed in my stomach. The smiling handmaidens and the crowd filled me with visceral disgust. The priest stood before the altar and raised his arms to the sky.
Almighty, loving God, accept this humble offering so that we might once again bask in your splendor. Bring this pure soul to the promised land so that she may stand by your side.
He nearly sang the words. The crowd fell to their knees and clasped their hands. The bride tried to sit up, but was forced back down by the handmaidens.
Sister, what?
I forced myself to step back to the altar. I had a duty to at least be by her side.
Close your eyes. It will only be a moment. Then everything will be fine.
I took her hand in mine and rubbed it with my thumb. My touch seemed to give her some peace. Her breathing steadied, and she looked deep into me, through me. I wondered if her mother and father were in the crowd. She didn't seem to recognize them. She still trusted them, if that meant anything. The bride closed her eyes. A glint nearly blinded me as the priest reached into his robes and withdrew a long, ornate dagger. That pit in my stomach grew deeper, and the blood drained from my face. The bride scrunched her delicate features up, bracing for something she couldn't see. I felt moisture in my palms as both of us sweated.
Prostrate yourselves. Feel his presence.
The priest stood over the bride and readied the knife over her heart. A few errant tears formed at the corner of the bride's eyes.
What's going on? Sister, please. I'm scared.
Her voice warbled. Before she could open her eyes, I reached over and covered them with my hand.
It's all right. There's nothing to fear. I'm here with you.
I couldn't stop myself from shaking. The 2 handmaidens beside me looked down at me and whispered something to each other. In unison, the priest and all the monks on the altar chanted a prayer in our sacred language. It came out like a song, a slow, deep, meandering tune that dulled the senses. The bride's chest rose and fell steadily. She whimpered, but no longer panicked. Just a few feet above, the dagger loomed with its pointy tip angled at her heart. Humming broke out over the assembly, the signal for the ceremony's final moments. I looked over the crowd and spotted a man and woman near the back. Rather than join the rest, they stood silently, no emotions on their stony faces as they watched the proceedings. It must have been the bride's parents. I wanted to run to them, to beg them to take their daughter so far away the temple could never reach her. But 18 years of captivity, of devotion, won through pain, paralyzed me.
Is it over yet?
The bride squeaked out. I put my forehead to her hand and pressed myself into her, feeling her heat.
I'm sorry I can't do more for you. Please.
The humming stopped abruptly, and the priest roared, plunging the knife downward. The tip met her skin and pierced clean through. Past fat, past flesh, between ribs, it jammed itself deep into her sternum, shattering the bone. The bride's body lurched, and she let out a breathless gasp, choking on nothing. The priest dragged the blade to her belly button, flaying her open like a gutted fish. Blood gushed from her body, soaking the altar, and I could see each of her organs still pulsating with the last shreds of life. I kept my hands over her eyes the entire time. Her blood soaked my knees. She coughed and spluttered weakly as her final moments passed. This was the 10th ceremony I'd witnessed, but it was always from a distance. That time, I felt her convulse, smelled her viscera, heard her gasps and moans. My stomach churned, and I choked back vomit. Her hand went limp in mine, and I backed away from the altar, unable to bear another second near the gory scene. The crowd below stood in perfect silence, arms raised to the heavens. The priest placed the dagger on the altar next to the corpse. He pulled up his sleeve and plunged his hand into her open chest cavity, fishing around until he caught hold of her heart, which no longer beat. He took a smaller, more precise instrument and severed all the arteries attached before pulling it free. Tears welled in my eyes, but I fought with all my might to keep them from spilling onto my cheeks. The priest carried the heart to a bowl near the altar, dropping it inside and dousing it with some fluid.
Bear witness, all of you, to our devotion.
The priest addressed the crowd. A nearby monk carried a torch to the bowl and laid the open flame over the heart. With a flash, an inferno spewed from the bowl. Heat tingled across my face. The bowl burned until the contents burned to ash. Then the priest turned to me.
Take her.
He pointed to the lip of the mountain, where the bride's bodies were cast into the depths, ending the ceremony. Why did it have to be me? I didn't want to touch the bride. My hands were filthy, but maybe after shepherding her to her death, it was my burden to bear. I reached down and pulled her eyelids closed. I couldn't have those milky irises boring through me. Scooping her frail frame into my arms, I marched up the mountain, with the 2 monks and the priest following close behind. The eyes of the crowd burned a hole through the back of my skull. Each step was laborious, while the girl was light as a feather. An unseen burden crushed me. When I stood over the edge and looked down into the abyss, there was no bottom, only endless, smothering darkness. I didn't move for a long while, my arms and legs rigid.
Cast her down, handmaiden,
the monk urged me. The bride was still in my arms, and any signs of life were now long gone.
Make haste,
the other monk hissed from my side. I was disrupting their pathetic performance. For the slightest moment, I imagined sending the priest tumbling down into the depths, but I quickly fought off my sinful urges. It was such a long way down and looked so empty, so lonely. I didn't know the bride well. It was hard to say why letting her go felt so difficult, but my arms weren't obeying me. Her brief affection and admiration was the first glimpse I'd ever had of those things. I didn't know who to blame. Myself for betraying her trust, the temple for carrying out these vile rituals, or God himself for choosing her.
Handmaiden, don't delay the process any longer.
The priest growled at me, his old brow furrowing in fury.
But,
I stammered, my whole body shuddering.
You,
The priest gestured at the monk.
"Do it,"
he ordered. The monk ripped the bride from my arms and tossed her off the edge. Her limbs dangled spread eagle, and the wind whipped at her long black hair. Her figure grew smaller and smaller before the shadows swallowed it. The priest and the monks didn't bother watching her body complete the fall. They walked off before she was out of sight, leaving me alone to gaze at the nothingness. Another prayer echoed behind me, led by the priest, but I stayed still until the ceremony ended, until each person had cleared from the altar and the surrounding area. I stood by the ledge in silence. Only after the sunset did I wake from my stupor and drag my weakened body back to the servants' quarters, where I would lie awake for the next 3 nights. Life at the temple moved on. Other handmaidens had seen my antics. I heard them whispering behind my back. Few people approached me. I was shocked that no one called me to the chamber of penance, but I wasn't about to question the small mercy they had given me. Time passed, but I could never get the little bride out of my mind. Her death revealed the absurdities in the temple. Not half of the tithes went towards upkeep. The leadership sat on the gold like a dragon guarding its hoard. My heart grew heavier as the seasons changed. A year had passed, and the ceremony approached once more. As before, I had the privilege of tending to the bride. The woman sat in the chair before me, her face contorted into a permanent grimace. She was my age, perhaps a year younger. Her arms were bruised, and a few cuts and scratches marked up the soft skin on her face. The new bride. I pressed a wet cloth to her cheek and wiped away the dried blood. The bride winced and pulled away from me.
Hold still, it'll be over soon,
I assured her. It would be difficult to conceal the mess they made of her fully. Luckily, the swelling wasn't distracting enough to sully her looks.
Why did you lash out at your escorts? You must have known it would end this way,
I asked. The other handmaidens were abuzz with the story. The bride clawed and scratched the monks when they took her from the village. She put up such a fight that they beat her until she could hardly move. She glared at me.
Am I meant to accept this fate? Your people condemn me to a death for this barbaric ritual.
The bride looked to the door, likely still thinking of escape. 2 monks waited just outside, guarding the door with long ornamental spears. I rubbed off more dried blood and some grime from tussling on the ground.
I don't know. Being a bride is the highest honor a woman can achieve for our people.
I recited tired rhetoric I didn't believe. The bride scoffed.
The temple knows nothing of honor.
Her face fell, and she sunk into her chair.
I was engaged. I wanted to build a family and leave this island. Then this cursed mark appeared, and your people dragged me from my home to my death.
The bride bit her lip, her eyes watering.
I despise your temple and your god.
I finished cleaning her wounds and rubbed them with salve. The ceremony would begin the next day, and God would not accept a dirty bride. Also, the priests said.
I'm sorry.
I broke the silence after a few minutes of brushing her hair. The bride wouldn't look at me.
Will you help me?
She asked. I couldn't answer. I was bound to the temple. Resisting would be rejecting everything I understood, and it would only bring pain. Facing the temple was akin to facing God, and what was I before that kind of power? The bride waited for me, but when I didn't reply, she broke down into tears.
Damn it! Damn you all!
The bride shot up from her chair, kicking across the room, and turned to me, snarling. I took a quick step back, but before I could distance myself, the bride crouched down and lunged at me. With a swift grapple, she tackled me to the floor, pinning my arms as my head smacked the stonework. My brain rattled as I struggled against her. She had me trapped.
What?
I sputtered, but she covered my mouth with a free hand. I kicked and thrashed, but I couldn't buck her off. The monks outside hadn't heard the scuffle. She fumbled with her robes, searching for something tucked away. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon and found a hairpin on the floor. The bride found what she searched for in her robes, a pin of her own. We grabbed the pins in unison, and I thrust it upward blindly. I felt a searing pain as her pin lodged itself deep in my shoulder. The bride shrieked as my pin jammed into her eye and popped it like a balloon. She fell off me, rolling on the floor and clutching at her wound. The sight made me nauseous. I felt immediate remorse. I wanted to reach out to help, but my body wouldn't obey. The monks rushed into the room. One of them grabbed the bride and hauled her off, and the other took hold of me under my arms and dragged me away.
Help! Please!
I begged the monk, yanking the pin out myself and watching the blood soak my robes. The monk maintained his stony silence and took me straight to the chief handmaiden. The monk dropped me to my knees in front of the woman, my body thudding on the floor.
Forgive me, ma'am. The bride attacked me, and I was forced to defend myself. She is injured, but will live.
I slurred my words, lightheaded from the blood loss.
You've disfigured the bride before the ceremony, spitting in God's face. Now I must present him with a defective offering.
The chief handmaiden spoke slowly and deliberately. Each word stung me.
Forgive me.
I felt the world spin, but I fought to stay upright.
What made you think your life was more valuable than keeping the bride pure? Foolish girl.
She took a long drink from the tea on her table before her.
Forgive me,
I begged once more. The chief handmaiden looked to the monk. Take her to the chamber. The monk picked me up and slung me over his shoulder.
But wait!
I protested weakly. Darkness ate at my vision, and I struggled briefly before the world went dark. When I came to, I was in a cell, propped up in a chair like a doll. The walls were lined with jagged rocks, and decades of dried blood left the stone floor a deep shade of red. They had bandaged my wound, but it still sent dull waves of pain through my body. A small stream of water trickled down the wall. Thick steel bars blocked my escape. I was alone in the chamber. Only a single torch across the room provided any illumination for the space. The ceremony must have started, and they would have already put the bride on the altar like the others. All her fighting would mean nothing. It never did. I waited for someone to come for me. I'd heard stories. Some girls lost nails. Others had their teeth pried from their gums until they could only taste blood for months. Hours passed, and nobody came. It was so very quiet in the chamber. Only the steady trickle of water broke through the deafening silence. My body ached, and my stomach growled. I felt a gnawing hunger building up inside of me. By the time a day passed, I had to lick at the moisture on the rocks to soothe my cracking throat. The second day came, and I had yet to hear a noise. All of my excrement piled up in the cell's corner, causing a stomach-turning stench that assailed me every waking moment. Not that I could sleep much, regardless. 4 days passed, and I could hardly move. I curled into a ball and cradled my gut, which cried out in constant agony. By the 7th day, I no longer felt hunger, just a terrible emptiness that consumed me. The lingering guilt stung as much as any other pain. Eventually, I heard something, but it wasn't from the cell. Giggling reverberated around the chamber. The sound of the child bride the year before. I'd catch a fleeting glimpse of her, a whisper of movement at the edge of my sight, like a phantom in the corner of my eye, disappearing as soon as I turned to look. On the 10th day, the last bride stood in the corner of my cell. She was perfectly quiet, with 2 gaping holes for eyes. Her torso was flayed open and her guts spilled to the floor. I stared at her for hours, but when I reached out to touch her, she vanished. 19 days passed, and I couldn't be sure whether I was still alive. I came to an epiphany. Whether I was alive or not didn't matter. There was no life in the temple. It was a vile place that dealt with death and pain. If I lived, the temple would force me to bring more suffering. If I died, maybe I would ascend to heaven to spend eternity with the God I had come to despise. I heard the voices of the brides all day long. They explained the excruciating pain they felt on the altar before crawling around the floor and up the ceiling. Day 20 came, and a new light shone from the corridor. A monk walked into the chamber and unlocked the cell without a word. I didn't know if this was real or a dream, but when he lifted me off the floor and carried me out of the cell, I fell asleep in his arms. It took me 2 months to recover. When I woke up every day, I still thought of myself as trapped underground. I needed something to push me forward. The temple tried to use fear. I wanted to fuel myself with hatred, but resignation doused those flames. Even after my imprisonment, I was still responsible for the brides. The ceremony approached once more. The latest bride stood at the bottom of the step, near the mountain, flanked by 2 unarmed monks. She was the oldest bride I'd yet to see, likely in her late 20s. There was an ephemeral beauty about her. With the presence of a spectre and dark, sunken eyes, she seemed to suck the light in around her. It was like looking into a mirror. She had that vacant countenance that confronted me in every reflection. "Come." I offered her my hand for the journey. She nodded lightly and took it, drifting alongside me up the long path. Her hand felt icy, and her fingers were slender and dainty. When we entered the temple, the other handmaidens were captivated by her, whispering among themselves and pointing as we passed. We entered the bridal quarters, and she stood silent and still.
Is there anything I can do to make this easier?
I asked. She shook her head.
Does it hurt?
The bride sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling.
They always cry out in pain. I want it to be over quickly. How much does it hurt?
I remembered the look of agony on the child bride's face and the screams of the last bride when the pin pierced her eye.
I don't know. I see.
She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing for a long while.
What do you think of the temple? Of God? I was married when they selected me as a bride. When the temple came to take me away, my husband tried to fight them off. The monks pierced his heart with spears and threw his body into the ocean.
Her face remained perfectly still, but tears streamed down her cheeks. I felt my blood boil. It stoked the fires of hatred.
Why don't you fight?
I asked through clenched teeth.
I have nowhere else to go, and nobody to go with.
The bride pulled the covers up and tucked herself into bed, turning away from me. She went quiet. I thought about reaching out to her, unsure of what to do, but I pushed back the instinct and left the room. Night fell, and I lay awake in my quarters. I counted the lines in the ceiling, but I replayed visions of blood, screams, and resentment. I felt someone standing at the foot of my bed. The brides from my past stood before the bed and watched me. The child bride sported the same naive grin she had greeted me with those years ago. The other bride wouldn't make eye contact. She seemed embarrassed. I sat up in bed to meet them.
What do I do?
I asked the ghosts. They vanished as soon as I acknowledged them. I couldn't do it. I couldn't have another life on my hands. How long could I make the same excuses? Whether I deserved forgiveness was meaningless. I don't know if I could make up for anything, but I had to do something. I pulled myself out of bed and threw on my clothes. Several monks were guarding the temple grounds, but I could travel anywhere within the temple with the bride. Rushing to her room, I threw open the door and marched to her bed. I tapped her shoulder through the covers.
Bride, wake up.
She stirred and flipped to face me, blinking sleepily.
Well, what? We're leaving. Come with me.
My heart hammered in my chest.
Leaving? The temple?
She sat up, regaining her senses.
We're leaving the island. We have to hurry.
I pulled her out of the bed and across the room.
Wait, how are we? Trust me.
We cut through the garden to the big stone walls that lined the perimeter. The guards who spotted us along the way thought nothing of it, and by the time I veered off the usual path, we were out of sight. A loose slab blocked a gap in the walls. I pushed it aside and ducked through the crack with the bride in tow. The woman was still in shock or disbelief, but my excitement was growing by the minute. A small smile crept across my face as we flew through the thick forest toward the docks. I'd overheard the priest talk about how a trading vessel came to port and planned to leave the morning after the ceremony. We made it to the dock, our shoes ripped to shreds and chests heaving with the exertion. Some light had returned to the bride's eyes, and she looked absolutely radiant. I led her to the ship just as the sun rose, and we stowed away under the deck behind the barrels and cartons. My body shook with a concoction of nerves, fright, and anticipation. Through the small window below the deck, I saw the traders return to the ship and prepare to set out. Finally, we pulled away from the dock. The bride lay on her back, covering her face as emotions overwhelmed her. The island grew small as we sailed off. I couldn't take my eyes off it. For a moment, the only sounds were the bride's muffled sobs, the call of the birds, and the splashing of waves. Then a cataclysmic boom echoed from the island far in the distance. I covered my ears and staggered backward. Lava shot from the mountain and rained hell upon everything in the area. Even from that distance, I thought I could hear screams. Flames engulfed the village, the forests, and, finally, the temple. Plumes of ash climbed to the heavens, and the scorching heat radiated as far as our ship. The bride squealed as our ship shook from the explosion. Once I regained my bearings, I couldn't look away from the destruction. I couldn't help but laugh as ash and molten rock buried the island. I wasn't the cause of the suffering. They could blame it on their god. As far as I was concerned, let it all burn. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.